So we've got just an hour, so this is going to be a slightly abridged version. So please, if you have questions or if there's something I left off or left out, just approach me at the end. Can everybody hear me in the back? Okay, good. So I'll just say a couple things about the neighborhood that we're in really quickly and then get into the story of Leopold and Loeb. So ever since it was founded in the mid-1850s by the physician and naturalist John A. Kennicott, Kenwood has been a sort of neighborhood of exclusive residences, and you can gather that just from looking at some of the houses around you. Now, who actually resided in these houses has sort of changed over time. So in the latter part of the 19th century, you would have figures like the meat packer Gustavus Swift. You would have figures like William Rand of the Rand McNally Map Company, right, publishers. And as you know, we leave the 19th century and go into the 20th century, you would have figures like the gentleman who lived right across the street there, Julius Rosenwald, who was the head of Sears, and also active in the founding of the NAACP, and of course our very own Museum of Science and Industry as well. And he would have been contemporaneous with Leopold and Loeb and Bobby Franks. And more recently, the neighborhood has attracted such prominent residents as Louis Farrakhan, Muhammad Ali lived in Kenwood for a while, and of course the gentleman who's currently occupying the White House. In fact, we might come across some sort of security protocol and measures as we're kind of walking through this neighborhood, but in the early morning, they kind of left us alone. They just eyed us suspiciously. So we're going to go back to the year 1924, and specifically to the spring of that year. On the 21st of May, which was a Wednesday, Bobby Franks, who was 14 years old, was walking home. He was walking from the Harvard School of Boys, which we'll see in a couple minutes, which is just about a block north of here, back to his family's house, which was at 51st and Ellis. He had stayed after school in order to serve as an umpire in a game of baseball that some of his friends were playing. So it was the early evening hours. He's walking back towards his house. A couple paces behind him is a classmate by the name of Irving Hartman. Hartman can see Bobby in front of him. He pauses because, keep in mind, this is May, so April showers bring May flowers. Irving pauses because he sees a rather elaborate and ornate garden, and even though he's 10 years old, I guess he already has a sort of aesthetic sensibility. So he pauses for a moment to look at the flowers, and then when he glances back, Bobby is gone. He just manages to see a gray Winton automobile drive by, and this is what he'll later tell the police. And they will search pretty much the entire city of Chicago and the state of Illinois looking for gray Wintons. And of course, that would turn out to have nothing to do with the case and not be the type of car that was used in the commission of the crime. Also, on the same day, around the same time, near this intersection, a 17-year-old student at St. Xavier's goes missing. Her name is Gertrude Barker. She's living with relatives here, even though she's from Washington State originally. Initially, the police think perhaps the two disappearances are linked, but 5 days later, Gertrude is found living in a carriage house with her would-be husband, and she's promptly sent back to Yakima, Washington. In fact, there was no connection between the two stories. That said, the disappearance of Gertrude should give you a sense that even though this was a sort of exclusive neighborhood, an affluent neighborhood, it wasn't isolated from the rest of the city. Prior to Bobby's disappearance, there had been a whole series of burglaries that occurred closer to the university. There had been a couple unsolved assaults and even mysterious deaths. And Richard Wright, when he goes and writes Native Son, which was actually a Book of the Month Club selection in 1940, would use this neighborhood as one of the settings in the novel, and that's where the murder would occur. Keep in mind, it's also the 1920s, Prohibition era, crime in general is on the rise within the city. So even though you might think that Bobby's disappearance was somewhat sort of exceptional, which it was part of this kind of larger pattern of kind of crime and violence. So once again, Wednesday, May 21st, 1924, about 5:30 in the evening, 14-year-old Bobby Franks goes missing on the walk back to his house. Now we're going to go just a little bit north. We're going to stop at the Harvard School, and that's where I'll tell you about the Harvard School, but also about the Franks family a little bit as well. So, here we are in front of the Harvard School for Boys. So this was where Bobby Franks was starting off from on that Wednesday back in May of 1924. on his way home. So as you can see, he didn't have a very long distance to walk. If you look at the dates on either side, you'll see when the Harvard School was founded and when the cornerstone for this building was laid. This is not the original location of it. The building itself actually opened in 1918, so it hadn't been opened all that long at the time of Bobby's disappearance. The Harvard School was called the Harvard School because it was a college preparatory school. It was preparing the young men of this neighborhood and the Prairie Avenue neighborhood and other areas for college. Primarily at Eastern institutions like Harvard and Yale. Bobby's elder brother, Jack, was attending the school at the same time as Bobby, and he was actually preparing to leave for Dartmouth at the time of his brother's disappearance. Also, a lot of students would go from here to the University of Chicago as well. There were about 200 students at the Harvard School. Bobby was a rather good one, rather precocious, did get into trouble sometimes, but as a freshman he actually managed to make the school's debating team, which was quite an accomplishment. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. So on the day of the disappearance, Bobby was known for being fairly punctual and responsible. So when he didn't show up for dinner, his parents, Flora and Jacob, understandably became concerned. In his early evening, basically transitioned into evening, they became increasingly concerned, to the extent that Jacob Franks phoned the family lawyer, a man by the name of Samuel Edelson, and Edelson advised that they contact the school's superintendent and head back to the Harvard School. The theory was that perhaps Bobby had stayed after for some reason and accidentally been locked into the building. So Jacob Franks walks up 2 blocks to the Harvard School, accompanied by Edelson the lawyer. They search around the exterior of the school, actually find a window in the back that's been left open, and crawl into the school to look for Bobby. But of course, Bobby was a fairly intelligent young man, and if there had been a window that had been left open, chances were that he would have found it and already found his way back to his house. This entire time, Flora Franks, Bobby's mother, is left without any sense of what's going on back at the family home at 51st and Ellis. Between 10 and 10:30, she receives a phone call. The caller identifies himself as George Johnson and tells her that her son Bobby has been kidnapped. If you look at the newspaper accounts of the time, they claim that upon hearing this, Flora instantly fainted. She didn't even put the receiver back down, she just fell over. That's somewhat doubtful, but no doubt, she was very disturbed by this news. When Jacob Franks returns to the house and learns about this, he wants to go immediately to the police. Edelson advises against this, saying, let's hear what these guys have to say. They're going to send more information about a ransom. But by 2 that morning, Franks can no longer wait, and so they do decide to go and contact the police, and the investigation begins immediately. And initially, the police focused on teachers at the Harvard School. They had 3 suspects. The reason being that they theorized that the kidnapper most likely knew Bobby. All these individuals would later be exonerated, as would a pharmacist who fled from the neighborhood mysteriously to Louisville at the same time of the kidnapping. So the police followed a lot of false leads, but within a week they had already apprehended the actual killers. Here's a photograph of Bobby. He's 13 in this photo, not 14, but he's wearing an outfit very similar to the one that he would have worn on the day that he disappeared in 1924. So I'll pass that around. So we're going to head from here in a moment to our next site, but before we do that, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Franks family and their history. So Jacob Franks and his mother came to Chicago in the early 1890s, right around the time of the World's Columbian Exposition, and they actually operated a pawn shop located on Clark and near the intersection with Madison. And from that sort of humble beginning, Franks managed to amass a fortune, eventually branched out into real estate, and later into public utilities as well. At the time of his son's disappearance, it was estimated that he was worth about $4 million. The family had converted to the Church of the Christ Scientist, which had a real sort of was sort of centered in the Kenwood neighborhood in a lot of different ways. Solon Beeman, who designed the very first Church of Christ Scientist, was an architect who did a lot of work in this neighborhood. But if you want to see a sort of, or get a sense of Frank's influence within the city, I advise that you go to what is today the Chicago Cultural Center, was formerly the public library. And if you know, it has that very elaborate front staircase, and you'll see the names of various members on the board of the Chicago Public Library that helped to get that building erected. And there you'll see the name of Jacob Franks carved into the marble. So we're going to go just to the corner, and I'm going to take you guys a little bit to the right, and we're going to talk about sites on 47th Street that were connected to this case. If you look behind me right here, you'll see some examples of the sort of urban renewal period, which is a little bit outside our story. But back in 1924, 47th Street would have been a major kind of commercial strip. And there are actually a couple sites connected to this narrative that we're very close to. Right there in what is now that parking lot would have been located a stationery shop. And then the day before Bobby Franks' disappearance, one of the men who kidnapped him went into that shop and purchased some paper as well as an envelope. The very next morning, so this is the 22nd of May, 1924, around 8 a.m., a letter arrives at the Franks mansion. And it says, "Dear Sir, as you no doubt know by now, your son has been kidnapped." And then it basically lays out a sort of the details about the ransom. The kidnappers want $10,000. The bills need to be old bills. They want about $8,000 in $50 bills, $2,000 in $20 bills. And Mr. Franks should put all the money in a cigar box and wrap it up with newspaper and await further instructions. Now, at the same time that this letter is arriving at the Franks house, far south of here, near a place called Wolf Lake, which maybe some of you guys have been to. It's a nice nature preserve. Near the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks at about 118th Street, a man by the name of Tony Mink, also short for Minkowski, he Americanized his name. He had just emigrated from Poland. He was an employee of the American Maize Company, and he was getting off the third shift. He's walking back a way that he normally doesn't take because he wants to go to Hedgewish, which is a neighborhood in that area, and to a watchmaker's shop. His watch had been broken, it had just been fixed. He was going to pick it up. As he's walking near the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks, he looks down into the lake. There's a culvert there, and he sees what appears to be two human feet sticking out of the culvert. He goes a little bit closer, realizes it's a body, begins to panic, runs back up towards the railroad tracks, and fortunately for him, there's actually a signal repair crew on the tracks right then, and the foreman's a guy by the name of Paul Korff. Korff and his fellow signalmen go down. They realize that the young boy has already died. They think perhaps he may have drowned. They're not sure what happened, but they remove the body, bring it up close to the railroad tracks, and call the police. While they're waiting for the police, Korff begins to look around the scene, and he notices that a pair of glasses is there in the grass. He picks it up, doesn't know what to make of it at first. He knows that one of his members of his crew actually needs a new frame for his pair of glasses, is on the verge of giving it to this gentleman when the police arrive and say that might be evidence. And so Korff, of course, turns it over. Actually, there would be later newsreels made of Korff's discovery of the glasses, which are fascinating, because in that he wears like his Sunday suit and like a little hat, whereas he would have been like working at the time, but he like restages his discovery of the glasses. So by 10 in the morning, the police already have the body, and even though it's a long shot, because of course the Franks family believes that Bobby's been kidnapped, they send a family member down to the near Hedgewish to look at the body. And they identify the body as Bobby. Now at first they didn't think it could be Bobby for two reasons. One, the police suggested that the boy was a 10-year-old boy, but if you look at that photograph of Bobby, you'll realize he was rather of short stature, so that's how that confusion arose. And because of the glasses, they thought the glasses had belonged to the victim, and so they put the glasses on the body. But the family member right away recognized that they weren't Bobby's glasses. His body was actually, you see that apartment building there? There used to be a funeral home on that location, and that's where the inquest was held. The coroner determined that Bobby died as a result of asphyxiation. There was also signs of blunt trauma to his head, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Someone had made an attempt to sort of disguise the identity of the body. It would later be determined that the killers attempted to use hydrochloric acid to like disfigure, but it didn't work. All it did was stain Bobby's skin a sort of bright orange, so he was instantly identifiable. At the same time that Jacob Franks is getting a phone call, sorry, there's a lot of traffic, informing him that his son has died, a cab driver is pulling up in front of the Franks mansion. And Franks gets a second call from the George Johnson. Can you hear me back there? Oh, okay. So at the same time, right, that Jacob Franks has just learned that his son is dead. A taxi driver pulls up, and the kidnapper calls again and gives Franks an address of a drugstore on 63rd Street where he's supposed to go with the ransom money. But Franks forgets the address because, of course, he's just learned about the death of his son. And the ransom plot at that point begins to sort of unravel. But the glasses will turn out to be a very important clue, and we're going to talk about them a little bit more as we round the corner. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to go down to Greenwood, we're going to take a right, and I'll get in front of you guys and I'll stop us at the right place. Oh, and here's a photo of Wolf Lake. So this is the site of where the body was recovered. And here you can see police are sort of dredging the water near the culverts. I'll pass that around once people get here. So I'm passing around a photo of the crime scene, or at least where the body was recovered, down by Wolf Lake. And so it's a photograph of police dredging the water near the culvert, looking for additional clues. But as I said, the most significant clue was the one found by Paul Korf, which is this pair of spectacles. There's nothing terribly exceptional about the frames or the prescription. The prescription was fairly normal. The frames it's a tortoiseshell frame made of xylonite, a material that's not really used that much anymore. But what was singular were the hinges. The hinges were produced by a single firm in Chicago, the Almar Co. Company. And the Almar Co. Company prided itself on keeping meticulous records, so if your glasses were ever damaged, they could easily be replaced. So the police went to Almar Co., and some poor Almar Co. employee went through about 56,000 records. Was kind of the unsung hero of this case in some ways. And they were able to identify 3 people in the city of Chicago who owned a pair that had the same prescription, same style frame, same hinges. One of them was a woman, so she was discounted right away as a suspect in the murder of Bobby Franks. One of them, by a weird sort of coincidence, historical coincidence, was a lawyer who would later be one of the presiding judges at the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg trial. And the third person lived in a mansion directly behind us. And this was this gentleman here, Nathan Leopold Jr. Now his father came from a family that had been in the United States since the late 1840s, and then the Leopold family really made their fortune up in Michigan, near the sort of Mackinac Island, Upper Peninsula area. They'd gotten into dry goods initially, but then later expanded into shipping, and at the time that the Leopold family was living at this address, their interests were fairly diversified. Nathan Leopold was something of a prodigy. At the time of Bobby's disappearance, he was all of 19 years old, but he had already finished college and was starting law school at the University of Chicago. And like Bobby Franks, he had attended the Harvard School. Apart from the law, Nathan Leopold had 2 other great passions. One, languages. He claimed that he knew, at the time of his death, around 27 different languages, although it's debatable his level of fluency. And also birds. He was an avid ornithologist, and in fact, at this house that used to stand here, he had 3,000 bird specimens. The city of Chicago actually granted him a special permit so that he could carry a firearm and take it into public parks so that he could collect bird specimens. And he would often give birding classes for students at the lab school and the Harvard School. So the police arrive, and they ask Nathan Leopold if he had misplaced his glasses. First he claims he still has them but can't produce them. Then he admits the glasses must be his. But wait, he had just been at Wolf Lake a couple weeks before on one of his birding outings with some students, and they must have fallen off. And to prove this, he puts on his traditional, he actually had a birding outfit, which is great that he wore, and he puts the glasses where he would keep them in his outfit, and that attempts to show how they could have fallen out of his breast pocket. But no matter what he does, however he flops over, the glasses stay stubbornly put, which makes the police somewhat suspicious. Around the same time, though, they're asking him, like, where were you on the night that Bobby disappeared, and so on and so forth. And he's like, well, I've got a very solid alibi. I was with my friend, fellow University of Chicago student, Richard Loeb. We were up in Lincoln Park most of that night and evening, so there's no way we could have committed the crime. So the police start to question Richard Loeb as well. And we'll talk about him a little bit more later in the tour. But there was another clue that in some ways seemed to connect Mr. Leopold to this case. So there were the glasses, but there was also that note, that ransom note. Now, what's interesting about that ransom note is Chicago journalists quickly realized that it was basically lifted word for word from a short story called The Kidnapping Syndicate, which had appeared in Detective Story magazine. So it basically came from a work of pulp fiction. Secondly, that it had been produced on an Underwood portable typewriter. Now, as the police began to investigate Mr. Leopold and Mr. Loeb, several of their classmates remembered Leopold owning a portable Underwood typewriter, which he would use to take notes for his law classes. And of course, when asked about this, he denied ever owning it. And then later, when the family maid mentioned having seen this typewriter, he said that he had misplaced it or lost it somewhere. And so this just increasingly made the police more suspicious. But the true break would come a little bit later on. We'll talk about that because we're going to round the corner and see what remains of the Leopold estate. So follow me, and you'll see something that actually dates from the estate itself.
So what's the site here then?
This is where the mansion is. So the mansion would have extended pretty much this entire lot all the way to the end of the block, almost. It was an enormous house, yeah. Yeah, it was a very, very big house. And if you're curious about Leopold's birds, many of them ended up in the collection of the Field Museum, which is kind of neat. And actually, the year before the crime, he caused a bit of a minor sensation when he rediscovered a bird, the Kirtland warbler, that had been believed to have gone extinct. He and a bunch of his birding friends went up to Upper Michigan and found some nests, including one of them was the father of James D. Watson, who would later, of course, along with Thomas Crick, discovered it really weird. And actually, yeah, and Kennicott's son, Robert Kennicott, was a student of Jared Kirtland and named the Kirtland snake, but not the warbler. So there's all these odd connections across the centuries between these different figures. All right, we're going to just turn the corner right there, and I'll show you guys where to stop. Some of you will be able to see this clearly, others not where you're standing right now, but I invite you to look as you go by. So if you look directly in front of you, behind the house, you'll see a kind of like sort of faux Tudor structure. That's a carriage house, and that was the carriage house that was actually part of the Leopold estate. So it would have been there in 1924. And that's where the family's chauffeur, Sven England, and his family lived in the upper level. And why is this significant? Well, as I said, when the police approached Leopold, he used Loeb as his alibi. And they said that they'd spent the entire day kind of driving around the city, primarily in Lincoln Park. And that they were driving around in Leopold's red Willis Knight. But Mr. England could contradict that because the day of the kidnapping, he was working on the car pretty much the entire day. And so when the police questioned him, he revealed that he had been working on it, and that's how they knew that Leopold and Loeb were lying. They first went to Loeb with this information. He balked for a little bit, but then asked for a cigarette and then began to spill the beans. And when we get to our next site, I'll kind of talk about what they sort of revealed and the actual kind of unfolding of the crime. Right at the corner there, though, another important piece of evidence was recovered on the night of the kidnapping itself in the early morning hours. A green Willis Knight was seen driving south on Greenwood in the early morning hours. There was a night watchman by the name of Bernard Wolfe, and he saw an object thrown out the passenger window of that automobile. He recovered it, and it was a chisel that had the metal end of it taped. And on the wooden handle, there were some dark stains. And so that would turn up to be a part of the crime as well. And we'll talk about that at our next site. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk down to Ellis, and then we're going to walk south to 50th, which you'll realize when we get to Ellis, that's of course the same corner where Bobby Franks disappeared on the early evening of May 21st. So we're basically kind of like doing a giant loop. So we're going to head south, though, on Ellis to 50th. I mean, this neighborhood really changed a lot, particularly starting in the late 40s and through the 50s and early 60s. So what had been a series of large single-family homes, we began to see a lot of that space got filled in, apartment buildings got built, some of the houses got carved up into apartments, and that pattern has sort of continued with there still being some single-family homes, and then things like the Harvard School, which became condos and then apartments. So everybody here?
That was turned down. I mean, those apartments were built in the late 20s.
Yeah. So the Leopold family I mean, unlike the Loebs and Franks, they stayed for at least in the immediate aftermath of the case. We're still in the neighborhood, but then had left. Although there's still Leopolds in the Chicago area. So.
There's still a Loeb.
And there's still Loebs too, that's true. And I don't know, there's probably still some Franks as well, but I don't know, every once in a while, you know, you get people on the tours who have, it's interesting connections. Family member Sven England was on the tour. I mean, it's all sorts of strange. Is everybody here? Okay.
No, we're all here.
We're all here? Good, okay. So we just, you know, left where Bobby disappeared, and police and historians believe that basically where we are right here at this intersection is where he was murdered, at least according to the confessions given by Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. So on that day, that Wednesday in May 1924, they pulled up alongside Bobby when he was at the corner. They were driving a green Willys Knight. Remember, Leopold owned a red Willys Knight. This was a car that they had rented, and they'd actually spent months in preparation of the commission of this crime, to the extent that they'd even created a false identity. One Morton D. Ballard was a traveling salesman from Peoria who would occasionally rent rooms at the Morrison Hotel and also have to rent an automobile when he was here in Chicago. And so they actually rented it from a company on Michigan Avenue that was in the process of being bought by John Hertz of the Yellow Cab Company. That was sort of the basis of the Hertz rental car. So they weren't the first killers. No, I'm just kidding. Tease Hertz. Oh, sorry. I know, that's such a bad joke. Okay. I'm glad there's few people who get that when I said it. So they picked up Bobby, and the reason why is because Bobby was not a stranger to Richard Loeb. They were actually distant cousins, and occasionally Bobby would play tennis at the Loeb's house. They had a tennis court, and that's kind of how they lured him into the automobile. Richard Loeb claimed that he had bought a new tennis racket. Did Bobby want to see it? He was just a block from home. They could drop him off on the way. Only they didn't do that. They drove down here, and then they turned left onto 50th Street. And here's where, you know, it's hard to really figure out what exactly happened. If you read Nathan Leopold's version of the story, he was driving, Bobby was next to him, and Richard Loeb was in the back seat. If you read Richard Loeb's confession, he was driving, Bobby was next to him, and Nathan Leopold was in the back seat. What is known is that whoever was in the back seat attempted initially to knock Bobby out using a chloroform-soaked rag. When this didn't work, that individual used the chisel that I'd mentioned earlier to hit him over the head, which also didn't succeed in knocking him unconscious. So eventually, the killer, whether it was Leopold or Loeb, pulled Bobby back into the back seat with him and attempted again to use the chloroform rag, but in his panic, inadvertently stuffed it into Bobby's mouth and throat, asphyxiating him. So that's how he ended up dying of asphyxiation. Their original plan was that they were going to knock him out and then tie a rope around his neck, and one of them would hold either end, right, so that they would each pull at the same time and be equally responsible for the murder. But this is not what happened. In fact, nothing really happened as they planned. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, they'd already picked the site where they were going to leave the body, because as you recall, Leopold took birding groups down there. But it's still early evening, there's still sunlight, so they start driving south. They actually stop at a hot dog stand called the Dewdrop Inn and get some hot dogs and root beer with the body of Bobby Franks in the back seat. Wait for the sun to go down. Go down to Wolf Lake, find what they think is a place where the body won't be discovered for weeks or months, if at all, and deposit it there. But Leopold places his coat on the ground at one point and picks it up like this, upside down, which is how the glasses fell off and how Paul Korff was able to find them. So after they confess, they just began to kind of talk about the case at great length and basically fill in all of the sort of remaining details, including what happened to the typewriter, which is a photograph right here. I'll pass it around. The portable Underwood had actually been stolen from Loeb's fraternity house. He was a graduate of the University of Michigan. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But Leopold and Loeb had prepared for the kidnapping of Bobby Franks by committing a series of sort of petty crimes. Burglary, vandalism, things like that, which included the stealing of the typewriter that was later used for the ransom note. After the commission of the murder, they attempted to destroy all the evidence. Some things they were very sloppy about, like throwing the chisel just out of the car as they were driving. The typewriter, they put a little bit more effort into it. They pulled up the keys and mangled them, and then dropped the typewriter in the lagoon behind the Museum of Science and Industry, which is also a favorite place of Clarence Darrow's. The Clarence Darrow Memorial Bridge stretches over that lagoon, and he, of course, is the gentleman who would end up defending them when they were brought to trial. One last thing to say, even though they had planned out all the details of the crime, they wanted to leave the selection of the victim largely to chance. They knew from the beginning that they were going to murder this person. It wasn't going to be a ransom plot, and they wanted to see if they could get away with it because they had fairly elevated opinions of themselves. They'd read a lot of Nietzsche, and people always bring up the Nietzsche stuff, but they also read a lot of like bad detective fiction as well. So I mean, you have to keep in mind that they were, 18 and 19 at the time of this. So they knew that any boy that they picked in this neighborhood would be ideal for their plot because he would come from a family around here, someone who could pay the ransom. And in many ways, Bobby Franks was sort of the result of chance. He just happened to be there and be the ideal figure for them to pick up, which is why the ransom note began "Dear Sir" and not "Dear Mr. Franks," because when they typed it the night before, they still hadn't decided who they were going to kidnap. And now, are you okay with this?
Yeah.
All right. We have on our tour here the grandson of Julius Rosenwald, and he's going to tell us about his cousin, who would often talk about having been one of the potential or possible victims.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Peter Askley, and I am indeed the grandson of Julius Rosenwald, and my my cousin Armand Deutsch, who lived around here and went to the Harvard School, was supposedly at the top of the list of the potential victims of Leopold and Loeb, but fortunately for him, he had a dentist appointment on the day of the kidnapping, so he wasn't even around. But apparently his parents believed this story and cut things out of the newspapers involving the trial so that he wouldn't be frightened by it. The only other thing I wanted to say was that, of course, my mother knew Loeb, and he was held up as a model child, and her parents used to, reprimand her and say, "Why can't you be like Dickie Loeb?"
Well, that's true, right? I mean,
Yes,
I think that
is true. Yes.
they were both, and we'll talk about Mr. Thank you so much for sharing that. I always love when people who have some sort of connection to the story around the things and add information. So we're going to head down Ellis here, less than a block, and we're going to stop outside of what was the Loeb estate. I also encourage you to check out this really ancient Carol Moseley Braun bumper sticker that is on this. This thing is, how long has this thing been? Right here on the, that's like, also, a weird sort of vestige of Kenwood history hanging on there. So you're standing on the former grounds of the Albert Loeb estate. Of the three families that factor into this story, the Leopolds, the Loebs, and the Franks, the Loebs were by far the most affluent. Albert Loeb was a vice president at Sears Roebuck, and then basically immediately beneath Julius Rosenwald in that company. For lovers of art and culture in Chicago, Loeb was actually very instrumental in the founding of Poetry magazine, which is celebrating its centennial this year. It was started in 1912, and Loeb provided a lot of the initial funding for that publication. His son here, Richard, is the youngest graduate of the University of Michigan, so he graduated at the age of 18. Leopold had gone to the Harvard School, Loeb had gone to the lab school, but they knew each other through the neighborhood. At the time of Bobby's disappearance and murder, as I said, Leopold had just started law school at the University of Chicago, and Loeb had actually started graduate studies in history at the same time. So if you know that campus at all, you know that Haskell Hall and the law school are immediately across from each other, and on the day of the kidnapping, they actually met basically in the center point between those two buildings before heading back to get the rented automobile. Here is a photograph shortly before the Loeb mansion was torn down. You can see that this detail here is original to the house, so the gate is still here. So we've got the carriage house at the Leopold estate and the gate here at the Loeb mansion. And the fence. And as Peter said, like, these are very prominent families, very respectable, very civically active families. As a result of the case and the sort of sensationalism of it, a lot of them left the city. Many members of Leopold's family changed their name. The Loebs had a country estate up in Charlevoix, Michigan. The house there still stands. It's actually now owned by the city and used as a sort of outdoor music venue and community center. And the Franks family also left as well. They moved out of the house almost immediately and into the Drake Hotel. So Bobby's body was recovered on the 22nd. His funeral was held on the 26th. Oop, sorry. And this is a window believed to be the bedroom of Richard Loeb. Looking out that window, he could have seen Bobby's coffin being removed from the house, because that's the Franks' house right at the corner there, and that's where we're going to end our tour. But before we get there, I'm just going to talk, because we're running low on time, about the trial. So it was called, you know, the crime of the century. Lots of media coverage. They actually wanted to have the trial broadcast live on WGN radio, which would have been the first of sort of thing like that to have happened, but that got nixed. The families went to the best defense attorney in the country, who conveniently happened to be living in Chicago, and that's this gentleman here, Clarence Darrow. He had already made his reputation as kind of a crusading lawyer for labor rights and so forth at this point. The Scopes Monkey trial is still a little bit ahead of him in 1925, but he was also an outspoken opponent of the death penalty, and that's what the state was seeking in this case. And that's why he agreed to take this case, even though his defendants had confessed. Also, the promise of $1 million probably didn't hurt as well, even though the families would ultimately end up paying him only around $80,000, which is a big difference there. And given that he actually succeeded in doing what they wanted him to, that's kind of was disappointing for Mr. Darrow, because he was basically charged with the task of making sure that they wouldn't be executed. And both the state and the defense brought in all these witnesses and so on and so forth. I won't get into that. But what's best remembered, of course, is a sort of closing statement where he makes a sort of plea for their lives based on their youth, right? And also blames Nietzsche and some other things. Interesting thing about this, though, if you look, so the court transcripts are in the possession of Northwestern, and there's several pages missing because Mr. Darrow asked to see the transcripts before he turned his closing speech into a book. And what's interesting is if you read the final book and then you read what newspaper stenographers took down, there's a lot of discrepancies between the two. So it looks like in the published form, he basically made his argument much more coherent and polished and elegant than what he actually delivered in that courtroom on that day in September. Good thing, though, for Mr. Darrow is that the judge was a man by the name of John Caverly, who was also known as a sort of opponent of the death penalty, and was on the verge of retiring. And it was really his sort of decision that determined matters. And what he decided was that Leopold and Loeb should be sent to prison for the rest of their lives without any possibility of parole. That was for the murder charges. For the kidnapping charges, they were given sentences of 99 years. So life plus 99 years. Richard Loeb would live until 1936 when he would be murdered in prison in Statesville, near Joliet, for those of you who know where Statesville is. And Leopold, over time, would become something of a model prisoner. He would work in the prison library. He would be trained as an X-ray technician. He would voluntarily allow himself to be tested, have anti-malarial drugs tested on him during the Second World War. And by the 1950s, a real movement had begun to sort of get parole for Leopold. And this succeeds in 1958. And prominent cultural figures like Carl Sandburg, Earl Stanley Gardner, the creator of Perry Mason, came out on behalf of Leopold. 1958, Leopold is paroled. He moves to Puerto Rico, where he takes a job as an X-ray technician. He marries a woman, a widower, who owns a flower shop. And of course, he gets interested in birds again and in ornithology, and actually writes a guide to the birds of Puerto Rico, which is published in 1963. He lives until 1971, and upon his death, his organs are donated to science, including the very corneas that once were behind those glasses that led to their undoing. So we're going to head to the corner now, and we're going to take a look at the Franks mansion, and that's where the tour will end. Okay, So if you look behind you, you'll see the Franks mansion, the one house that still stands that's connected to this story. As I said, on the 26th of May 1924, this is where the funeral was held for Bobby. He was later interred at Roseland Cemetery, and Richard Loeb was able to see the casket being taken out of that door right there. You can see the stairs, and there's a door right on the right. Before the trial had even finished, the Franks family had abandoned the house. As I said, they moved into the Drake Hotel, and they never returned to this particular mansion. It was empty for a number of years. Over the decades, there have been attempts to turn it into a preschool and a nursery. Those efforts would always be short-lived. It was boarded up for a long time until recently, when once again it's being renovated. And I believe the plan is to actually divide the mansion into two and to turn it into 2 townhouses. Now, if you recall, when we were back at the Harvard School, I said that Bobby was a member of the Harvard School's debating team. And a matter of months before his disappearance and murder, he was asked to debate on the issue of capital punishment. And he actually argued against it. In some ways, I think it's appropriate that it's Bobby's house that still stands, rather than that of Leopold and Loeb. He often gets forgotten in this story. And at the end of the day, it really is a story about a boy who's simply trying to get home. So thank you all for coming on this tour. If you've got any questions, I'll be glad to stick around and answer them.